the use of presentation and data visualization. I'll let him talk a little bit more about this. But please join me in welcoming this award-winning professor. We're delighted to have him here to join us to talk about the subject.
What a great introduction. I grew up in the Midwest. It's just fantastic. I've talked to a number of people here, and I said if I'd ended up in Wisconsin, I would have, at University of Wisconsin, I would have said I died and gone to heaven. It's just a wonderful campus here and a wonderful reputation. I'm so privileged to be invited here, so thank you. So I'm going to talk about biodemography, and I titled it 21st Century Guided Tour, What Can You Do in 50 Minutes or an Hour, of course. But here's where, let me put, first off, biodemography into a global context. Just so we have demography, which is the study of population and the processes that shape it, birth, death, and migration. And biodemography we'll put into context as well. So if you look at all of sort of the layers here from atomic, molecular, all the way down to planetary and beyond, I view that demography is really it's what I call the skin in, skin out. You have skin in, which is the zoology, biology, and so forth. And skin out would be individual, outward, and so forth. So that's the domain of demography. When you extend to biodemography, it's basically putting humans, and by the way, I mean demography, as you know, the Demography Center here, that study primarily humans, but in fact, you put humans into the context of the tree of life. And that's where we come in with biodemography. And so that all animals, plants, have population, individuals, and so forth. So that we're taking these same basic principles and applying them and deriving new ones from biology writ large. So that's the context for this. So look, here's my talk, and that is I've divided it into three main parts. We have concepts and models. So I'm not going, Jenna mentioned my book. By the way, there's handouts there just as a little flyer over here as you leave if you're interested. But I'm not going, it's a methods and concepts book, and so what I talk about here is primarily some of the, I guess, concepts and the results, that sort of thing. And then because this is interested in humans, I assume many people here are interested in humans, I have a section here on human evolutionary demography. I'm developing some ideas there that I'll get into and cover that. And then the third main part would be demographic controversy. So I talk about that. I've been on a loop of an email with about 50 individuals. It's about this one is about the whether the authenticity of this Madame Guillemot, the oldest person ever to live. Huge, and so there's a Russian scientist that says, no, it's all a fraud. So anyway, I touch on that and a couple others. So that's where I'm headed here. So anyway, there's a mock-up of that's a mock-up of the cover of the book. Anyway, I'm going to talk about that just very briefly at the very end. So look, within the concepts and models, I talk about these different parts: lifespan, mortality, reproduction, health, and population. So let me start off with lifespan. Look, this looks like a Wisconsin northern lake, right? Every one of these has a lifespan, okay? And so you have here would be patrolling dragonflies. These live 2 to 4 months or so. You'd have swarming mayflies. This is some of the shortest lived animals. This is the adults anyway, and that would be 24 to 48 hours or so. You'd have this giant water bug. They actually live a very long time, 1 or 2 years. You'd have fireflies, maybe 3 to 4 weeks. Every one of these have a lifespan that's evolved. I say it's like a polar bear with a white fur and giraffe with a long neck. Of course these evolve. Lifespans also evolve. They're evolved traits. And so that's part of the suite of these interconnecting life history traits. So all of it has to fit together neatly. The reproduction, everything fits together, of which lifespan is part of that life history concept. And so that just as a quick survey here, I'll go through some lifespans. This is insects and arthropods. And so I already mentioned the mayflies, maybe 2 days or so. I'm sure you have hatches, huge hatches here probably in your lake. And moths, maybe a couple weeks. Mites, 30 days or so. Fruit flies, I'll just go through these. Grasshoppers, 6 months. Some of these big dragonflies can live a year or so. This would be tropical, and temperate like this, they die in the winter or fall. Wasp, maybe a year and a half. Ground beetle, a couple of years. This one, serious disease vector, reduviates. Rhinoceros beetle, 4 years. honeybees, you get into social insects, they live a very long time. I'll talk about that in just a bit. A tarantula, maybe 10 years or so, and you get up in termite queens that would live several decades. It's unbelievable. Then we have, so in other words, this is a 5,000-fold difference, okay? 5,000-fold difference in lifespans of insects, okay? Plant lifespans, you have short-lived, just move on up the scale here, and some of these poppy, peach, 10 years, and you get into some of these trees that live unbelievable, baobab, you know, several thousand years. This has been just in the New York Times, I saw an article on that. Anyway, up to maybe 5,000 years, and of course the redwood 4,000. You get a bristlecone pine 5,000 or so. So we're talking about 15,000 fold. Okay, and with avians, you get into birds, hummingbirds. Birds, by the way, are for their size are very long-lived relative to mammals. So like a hummingbird or a canary, it's the size of a mouse or rat. Mouse or rat would live a year or 2 or 3, and these things live 8 and 10 years. Birds in general are much longer lived. Okay, for their size. Pheasant, goose, condor, seagull, we'll just go on up here. And so these hornbills are fascinating. You get into these gray parrots. I'm sure you've all read about that, maybe 70 or 80 years or something. You buy a parrot, you have this for literally a lifetime. But so anyway, we're talking about tenfold. Mammalian, I'll finish off with this. Mouse, a couple years or so. And so we go on. By the way, seals are really long-lived for their size. And where I'm headed here is that, okay, this is interesting, sort of an overview, but the more interesting questions are why it evolved the way they did. That's where I'm headed here. And so rhinoceros, 50 years, gorillas, so these are great apes here, 60 years, elephants, 70 years, and so forth, okay? These orcas, maybe the females anyway, up to 90 years they estimate. And you get into humans, and so that's not the max, but nonetheless, we're talking about ballpark of a century or so. Humans are actually very long-lived mammals for our size. If we lived, just according to size, we'd live about 20 or 30 years, about like a white-tailed deer, about 150, 200 pounds right in there. Well, look, then we get into this. They discovered this a number of years ago, that the bowhead whale, they did some estimates on that from the eye sections, and also harpoon that they hadn't been around for many years. They estimate that lives up to 250 years. Every one of these, whether it's these mammals or the insects, all the way back a few slides, it's a question of why did they evolve this lifespan? It all has to fit together, okay? And so we're talking about 125-fold. But anyway, there's humans. We're actually very long-lived relative to the majority, but there's at least one. It's probably more than that, but at least one they found that lived very much longer, okay? So here's the question, though, what I find the more interesting question, and that is, what factors favor the evolution of lifespan extremes? Okay, so why do we get several thousand-fold difference in evolved lifespans? Okay, and so here's a lifespan evolution. It's what I call the phylogenetic floor plan. Okay, it's called the bow plan for the biologists. They call it. It's basically the floor plan. And basically, you start out. That's a starting point. Is that you have long-lived groups and short-lived groups. It's built into the design for being long-lived or short-lived, okay? So in this case, beetles are the turtles of the insect world. They're built to be long-lived so that they, as pre-adults, larvae, they use most of the resources to produce cuticles, so they have, their shells or whatever. And then when they emerge as adults, or close as adults, they have to go find food. So they have chewing mouth parts. They must live a long time because they have to acquire the protein to produce eggs and so on and so forth. Whereas by design, butterflies are shorter lived. And so that they put most of the resources into eggs, so that when they emerge as butterflies or moths, they're ready to lay eggs. They don't have to go find the protein and take the time to produce eggs. So by design, these are shorter lived and these are longer lived. Now you can have variation within each one of these, of course, but nonetheless, that's a starting point, is this floor plan. So with the beetles, you'd have cuticle, you'd have chewing mouth parts that are longer lived, butterflies, fragile wings, sucking proboscis, so they can just go get some nectar and so forth. and they're pre-ovogenic, that is, they already have their eggs. And you can get, butterflies that may live a year, some species, but you're not going to get 10 and 15-year butterflies. But you can get long-lived beetles, maybe 3 to 5 years or so, okay? Then the next level, you have that within these, in this case the beetles, you can have shorter-lived and longer-lived. And that's where the evolutionary ecology modifies the lifespan within these phylogenetic constraints. So if some species go to the desert, there's different lifespan adaptations for that environment versus the tropics versus any number of other environments. And so, anyway, that's the next level. Now, the longevity extremes. Not everything falls into these categories I'm going to show, but this is, it's stood up for 20 years or so since I developed this pretty well. And I have the first level is environmentally selected. And I use this nabib beetle. It's found in the Namibia, but in the desert. But that's the fog harvesting beetles or whatever. But they're in uncertain environments. I always say that the 100-year flood, not that they're having it there, is a good thing, or the every 10 or 20 years or whatnot, because it's the only time conditions are satisfactory for a reproduction. The other, they can survive through and so forth, but they need good conditions every whatever, that's when the uncertainty part, before they can reproduce. And so that any individuals that don't make it through that uncertain period, whether it's 10 years or 30 or whatever, it's just direct Darwinian selection. They're going to be selected out, and it's only the longer lived ones that make it. Okay? That's one category here of the uncertain environment. The other one would be low resource. I call it the Boolean cube in the swimming pool, is that the resources are there, but they're really dilute, and it takes forever for animals to acquire the resources to grow, and then also to reproduce. So the deep sea species, deep sea like tubes, and cave species and so forth would fall into that category. So you get some of the longest lived individuals, not just insects. This is generalized to desert reptiles or whatever too. So that's one category. Another category is this what I call socially selected, and that is short life and sociality are inconsistent. You can't have short-lived and sociality. It takes a while to develop these relationships and the division of labor and all that business that goes with sociality. And so you're selecting for very long life, in particular in the queens of termites and ants, and to a certain extent wasps and bees. But that's where these things can live 25 and 30 years. They're the ovary of the superorganism, and so it's very long-lived. And then a third category is what I call reproductively constrained. And so this is a tsetse fly. They would produce one offspring, what they call larviposit, that is, just have blood meals. They produce the larvae, the maggot, in their abdomen, and then they just deposit that larvae which pupates right away. They live a very long time. But there's many other species, even the seals, for example. This would be one explanation for them, is that you have about a 6-week period where you have conditions where they have to produce their pups, grow them, and so forth. If they produce 2, they dilute the resources. Both of them die. You got to put all the resources into one. And so, but to have a sure replacement, you have live a long time, so you have many chances to produce those. Bats would be another one. They produce one, most of them anyway, produce one offspring. You can't be flying around with a big litter and still dart around and get your moths and that sort of, to get your prey and so forth. So anyway, those are the extremes right in there, what the factors that favor extreme longevity in general. Okay. Now, for social species, there's a famous wasp biologist, Howard Evans, that developed this, the evolution of sociality in wasps. He had 13 different stages of the evolution from a parasitoid to the full eusociality. I collapsed them down to 4. And so this is the coevolution of sociality. So you ask the question, which came first? I think this applies to humans as well. But anyway, which came first, so to speak, the sociality or the longevity? Okay. what was a pre-adaptation for the other. So here's how it works, and that is where you have these 4 different stages, and I'll walk through these. So you start out with the solitary parasitoid. That's these little wasps, not social at all, they're just parasitoids. And the host is basically a living incubator. So they lay their egg in the host goes about its business, and then eventually that egg becomes a larvae and it eats the host and so forth. But there's no nest, and so therefore there's no parental care. So that's a starting point. The next series of stages you get to would be this mass provisioning, where you have a nest. So it starts out in the most primitive stage. It would be they just tuck the host under some detritus or whatever, kind of a pre-nest concept. But anyway, eventually they begin building nests. And what mass provisioning would be that they get their host, put them in this nest, to this chamber right in here, and then lay their egg on it, and then they seal the nest and fly away and die, and then the next year the offspring emerge. But anyway, the nest becomes the nexus. So now you have protection for not just the host, but also the mother can reside there, and there's a level of protection from that. They end up being longer lived, and you can produce fewer offspring because you have higher survival. And there's no generation overlap. That's the key. Now, when I was reading through this paper of Evans, there was a stage where this is it. And that is where you have progressive provisioning. So that first you have a longevity extension, and that is where the wasp is not mass provisioning, they come back like birds. This would be birds do progressive provisioning, that is as needed provisioning. So that they go out and forage, they come back and they feed their offspring with little masticated bits of food. And by the way, they lay their eggs first in the chamber. It's not like after the food's there. So they lay their eggs and then they start feeding them, okay? But anyway, daughters as helpers, and this is the key, is that you have extended longevity set this evolutionary stage. And that is where the mothers were still alive when the daughters begin to emerge. So now you have the conditions for incipient sociality to emerge, okay? And so that's the incipient sociality, right? So that the key development here is that the longevity of the mother is extended to overlap with the daughters, thus creating this incipient sociality. And now the daughters can go forage, take care of the nest and so forth, and the mother can be fed by the daughters, but also be producing eggs. So now it's the first level of sociality, okay? And then the next series of stages, you'd have the mother becomes the main reproductive, and so that she's very long lived. She becomes the ovary for this superorganism now, and the workers are short lived, so they're disposable basically. And anyway, divisional labor and very low pre-adult mortality. Anybody a hornet's nest or whatnot, those are like really defended fiercely, okay? So the bottom line here is that longevity extension and social complexity are mutually reinforcing. You have longevity extension, which sets the stage for greater social complexity, but then this greater social complexity then sets the stage for greater longevity, okay? So that's how that works, okay? So that's the lifespan. Next part, mortality. Most of you many of you are demographers, and so you know this, but just so everybody's on the same page here, is that age-specific mortality, anybody done life table, you can derive one parameter from the other, basically. But there's one parameter that's the most important, and it's age-specific mortality. And it's because it's risk. Risk underlies everything. So it's the probability of an individual alive at, this year, at age X, will die before the next year, okay? Now, I say mortality drives a life table. Survival is subject to mortality risk. Life expectancy is, you have a life expectancy, or people do, subject to that mortality risk from that year forward. Death distribution subject. So everything comes back to mortality risk. It's one of the most important parameters, as I've said, to study. Okay? Now, here is a survival curve of humans. So this is what the demographers here know. This is the LX schedule. And anyway, survivorship from birth, and that's the trajectory of a modern life table. Okay? Now, there is the mortality curve. This is a schematic, not to scale, to get the idea here. And so you have the probability of dying from 1 year to the next on this axis, and you have the age here. All right? And so we start out with typically it's higher. Infant mortality for the first year is higher typically than subsequent years until you get to the older ages. So let's just say it's 1 out of 500. This is modern 2010 rate somewhere in there for females. Okay. Then you have, this is the lowest of the life course. It's around 10, 11, 12 years old right in there. 1 out of 8,000. It's unbelievable. Little, at least 11-year-old girls don't die. I mean, it's very, very rare. Boys too. That's not quite that low, but nonetheless it's very low. So that's basically a universal too, is that you go to any place in the world and generally, you can scale this up and down, but generally the shape is roughly the same right in there. So that's the lowest point. So that may be 1 out of 8,000. Now you walk up to, say, age 50, 1 out of 400, still pretty low. I guess I jumped all the way up to there, and then you get out of 1 out of 2. And so it's 50%. I'm going to come back to this leveling out. This is one of the controversies right in there. I'll talk about that later. But look, you get some idea what it takes, if it's 1 out of 2, rough give or take at 100, to make it to 110, it's like taking 10 coins, throwing them on the desk here, and they all come up heads. That's the probability. It's very, very low. And so anyway, that's the shape of the mortality, and there's a huge amount of information in a curve like that that you don't see from all the other schedules. Survivorship was one of them. Okay. Now, here is the section that is called the Gompertz model. So that's an exponential rate of aging right in there. It's generally 8% per year. Although I presented this in Denmark with Jim Voppel, and he said, no, that's wrong, but I don't get it. I think it's 8%. But in any case, clear it's, down and up right in here for the early developmental stages and to age 30 or so. And then up here, this is where some of the controversy comes in, where it begins slowing. But in general, this is one of the most important, maybe the most important model in all of demography. It's certainly actuarial part of demography, and that's a Gompertz model. I tell my students, the good news is when you turn age 30, that you gain 8%. The bad news is it's a mortality risk every year. And anyway, there that is. Okay. Now, it's not possible to understand the actuarial properties of, in this case, insect cohorts and populations without understanding age-specific mortality. And so that we use this to study aging. Okay. Now, so the question that actually put our project on the map, this is 25 years ago or so to get started. I was working with James Voppel, which I assume at least the demographers know him by reputation. And this was back when the oldest old, 85 and beyond. Pardon?
Life was rectangular then.
For free, yeah, that's where he's headed. That's exactly right. But anyway, it was the oldest old. This is back in the the late 80s or so. And so the question was, and James Fries, I quote him right here, he's a rheumatologist at Stanford. And basically it's a length of life is fixed, okay? And do I have the quote from Encyclopedia there? No, not quite. But anyway, there's another quote. We can get them all over the place. There's one in Encyclopedia Britannica. Not that that's the scientific source, but it's written by, advised by scientists. It's like there's an age to which people can live, but nobody can live beyond. There's, of course, zero evidence for that. Zero. Okay? And so where I'm headed here, though, too, is that raise your hand if you don't think that you can live forever. Of course not. But raise your hand if you think there's a single age to which people can reach and then nobody can live beyond, no matter what you do. I'm not actually literally asking you to raise your hand, but that's the point. And so that anyway, so we challenge this, and so the idea here is that if that is fixed, then you should have an age, literally, to which people can survive to, or name your species, in this case flies, And no matter what you do, you can't change that. It's like a time bomb. And so that there should be a wall of death here. Okay? Now you can actually test that with if you have enough insects, which we did. So anyway, I was working, had a student who, I've always been in I've just been fascinated by demography from day one when I got into science, basically, entomology. But you have to pay the bills somehow, and so you do it any way you can. But I was working with a student who was not a student at the time, but he was director of this factory right here. This in Tapachula, Mexico. You can just look over there, and there's Guatemala. It's right on the border. USDA in Mexico built this for medfly production to prevent the spread. They sterilize them, and so it doesn't work, but that's a detail here. But anyway, they raise 1 billion flies. That's 5 tons of flies a week. 5 tons. And so we had, okay, you can make some major life tables from that. And so that's kind of what we did. And that really, Vappel started salivating over that when he heard that. But anyway, it was sort of the planets were aligned right, and we all got together, you know. It's just one of those scientific things that happens once in a while. But anyway, so we did a study with this many. We had 1.2 million flies. And the reason you need numbers, I talk about that in just a bit. But, you know, the very thing you're measuring is the deaths. Well, the trouble is you run out of flies. And so I would say if you have, 100 mice, and you want to look at the last 10% that live, now you have 10 mice. That's really that's nothing, okay? Now you have a million mice, and you have 10% left, you have 100,000. Those are major numbers to ask the question about what's the trajectory. That's where we're headed with mortality, okay? So that this was a study that came out in Science back in '92. I left that whole page. That's when Iceman. It was the same issue as Iceman. And I go, God, maybe that's going to overshadow everything of ours. But anyway, it didn't. But anyway, it's a slowing mortality at the older ages. So we have that. So look, here's the mortality, and that's why mortality is so important. We're not interested in how long they live per se. We're interested in the trajectory. And so that we had, what do we have? So this is mortality right in here, and this is age. Now, when you look at this, if we had small numbers, we'd say, well, it's obvious that it's just going straight up into study, okay? But we still had 300,000 alive right in there, okay? Now, so then it started leveling off, and in fact, clear at the end, it started to decrease. And so here's what you have. You had the rapid increase of this, and then you had a shoulder, which is a little bit of a detail, but it's actually real. It's pretty interesting. And then you had a peak and you had a decline. But the main part here was really, it was slowing. That's the carry away for this talk, but also for our paper. And so it wasn't just a wall of, it was not a wall of death. So we can demonstrate that, no, it doesn't just continue to go up at the oldest ages. And so the main findings was that it slows at older ages, no wall of death. It's what I called at the time indeterminate. And so the lifespan it's like with indeterminate and determinate growth, or egg laying comes from bird studies or whatnot. If you have albatross lays 1 egg, right? That's a determinate egg layer. Chickens lay whatever, but they're indeterminate. But they don't lay an infinite number. They lay a lot, but it's not one number. It's the same thing with lifespan, is that I call it indeterminate. You can never put one number on it and say, that's the number, that's the age to which people can live, but nobody can live beyond. Okay. So anyway, why we needed 1.2 million flies? This metaphor, it's the Vappel developed, and that is, it's like the Hubble telescope of the actuarial world. You can peer into the far reaches of the actuarial universe, when you have big numbers. The thing is, if you have small numbers, it's mortality, so that it's going to bounce around. Small numbers, what can you do with that? That would be 100 flies. Now you have 1,000. You still kind of a straight line, but you run out of flies, so you get messy. Anyway, you keep going here. 100,000. Whoops, here. You get 100,000. Now you're getting someplace where you can make more definitive statements about the true trajectory. That's why you need a lot of flies. You could never do this with small numbers. You could never do this with mice. You'd never get up to 1 million mice. Okay. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Okay, but look, this just came out last year or so, here's a plateau. Again, this is controversial, but in any case, this is 105-year-old Italian women. And so that Vappel, it's Elisabetta Barbi in Italy, got the data. She's the lead author here. But anyway, there's the mortality. Here's the age starting at 105. You see the flat, that is basically age-independent mortality at the oldest ages for these. The problem with a study like this is these are cross-sectional and they're not longitudinal studies, okay? One of the problems. Okay, I'm going to burn through this because I want to get through all this. We combined, you look at combined sexes, and so there was our original curve here, but you disaggregate it, and you get really interesting patterns here. You get a crossover. Demographers know this is really interesting for the black-white crossover. But in fact, why would males continue to age here? Because it's continuing to go up, but females start to level off and so forth. A lot of interesting questions there. I'm just going to go through this because I want to get through my whole talk here. What we ended up with that crossover is what we called a male-female longevity paradox, is that the males are have the highest life expectancy, but the females are the last to die. And so that's what happens when you get this kind of dynamic, okay, with mortality, okay? Follow-up sex, here's one right in here, look at that, okay? If you change the diet, so that I said, you know, I can generate just about any mortality curve that you'd like by manipulating the environment, and you can kind of do it. And that is, if you just feed them, these are big numbers too, not a million, but 100,000. Look at that, you get females, and then males right in here, and so there it is, you get the crossover with sugar diet only, okay? Then you go to full diet, which is protein included, then you still get a crossover, but now the males are higher and the females lower. And then you sterilize them, and now you don't get any crossover at all, okay? So that it's really plastic, the mortality trajectory. This, I think, applies to humans as well. It's this controversy that I'll talk about at the end here, okay? Main result, sex mortality differentials are age and context specific, okay? Not just age specific, context specific. And it's the female mortality, the response that drives the sex mortality, is that you actually find the males kind of and the females are bouncing around. So if I wanted to spend more time on that, you're going to see the males are fixed, and it's the females that really are affected most by the changes in environment.
How do you sterilize 100,000 flies?
No, it's with cobalt-60 radiation. That's what they do, is sterilize them and release them, yeah. Put the pupae in big bags and put them through this cobalt-60, yeah. So, okay, so look, let me keep going here. Reproduction, I'll go through this, is that the way we went from putting, you know, several thousand in a cage, so the group cages, to holding them individually. Again, the demographers know this. It's individual level data. Just that's where it's at. And so that we're measuring individual level fly reproduction. So that you have here, if this is a fly life course, and you measure reproduction, the first day you may have 0. Where I'm headed here is to color code them, and then we're going to bring it all together into a graphic. And then maybe the second day, no eggs. So they have a pre-reproductive period. And then they start laying a few eggs, you know, 1 to 50, 1 to 50. Then a lot of eggs, and so you can color code these in different ways. Now, you have that life course, the reproduction, or event. Could be blood pressure, it could be heart rate, whatever event you want, within that age group and individuals. Now you take 1,000 of these, you color code all of these, and then you get a graphic like this. Okay. By the way, you can do this on Excel with conditional formatting. If anybody's interested, come to my talk tomorrow. I'll show you. But in any case, this is 1,000 lines, 1,000 individuals, all color coded. So you see the pattern there, the medfly, a different species right in here, and this would be Drosophila. So look at this right in here, and then you can see just a slice of, you know, of the reproduction here over age and individuals, and you can see immediately that there's different ecologies here, different reproductive patterns, and so forth. These are great diagnostic tools. You pick out nuance that you don't if you just crunch the numbers, okay? And so that also, we did one, I'm going to get through here. This is thanatological age, if you know that or not, but it's time to death, okay? So if we look at this, this would be chronological age right in here, the pre-reproductive period, high reproduction grades off here. This is the death. Now let's normalize them on the right, and so that now you have time to death. And so we're going to let, there's thanatological age, and now we have this edge normalized over here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we're interested in this, and that is, the question is, what do individuals before they die have in common? Whether they die at 10 days old or 90 days old, okay? And you can see here that the ones that live the longest, this is time to death, so they're all 20 days from death here, okay? A little bit different pattern, but if you just look at the slice right through here, there's actually there's quite a bit in common here. We're trying to, there's about 3 main patterns. One's a decrease, one's a crash, and one's just 0, okay? But anyway, we're just in the middle of this looking at the end of life patterns. It's really, really pretty interesting. Okay, there it is right in there. Okay, health. Here is, you know, in ecology, it's health, they haven't done much with it. There's some in conservation biology because you get turtles tangled up in nets and that plastic in whale stomachs and that sort of thing. But in general, there's not as much, and they have a huge amount to learn, if there's any ecologists here, from human demography. And I was going to show you here, see if I have this. Yeah, there it is. So we do, I go to Africa a lot, and we do this. There's an injured dove. Here's a baboon. This limp started back here. I didn't pull my camera out in time. Here's wild dogs. By the way, these are very rare. We ran across these. And here's one here that has serious problems. And then you get these African buffalo.
Maybe a little stressed.
When you go on safari, start looking for this.
Maybe it's because we're here.
There's really one that's in bad shape, okay? So that health in ecology, there's huge amount of work there to be done. It's really has great potential. So, but in any case, back to insects, as we found a health concept, discovered one in our medflies, my colleagues did in Greece. And here is the deal, and that is where you have, this is live medfly, that's what it looks like. There's supine, okay? They end up on their backs, sort of in a, what I call a, it looked like a tonic immobility. I didn't know it at the time, but it's kind of like that. They're just catatonic on their backs. Most people, which including us, thought they were dead. You sweep them out and count them as dead, but in fact they're just kind of have a paralysis for a while, and then they recover. And there's a real dead one. And so there is the pattern. Here again is this event history patterns right in here. And you can see this is really serious in here. It's sort of onset here, and there's none here of the supine behavior. And you can see this is time to death specific and not age specific, okay? And you can also see in general, once you see a sign of that, they've got about 2 weeks left. And so it's predictive. I'm just going to go through this right in here. We only had 1% pre-supine that died. Most of them ended up displaying some level of that. And you have here, basically it's universal, it's progressive, so it gets worse, and it's predictive, so you can say, well, 2 weeks, give or take, they're dead, and it's irreversible. We didn't see any recover. And the advantage of that is that then, that is having a model like that, you can get into the active versus total life expectancy. Again, the demographers here know all about this. But you have here the active life expectancy, that is before disability and onset of chronic disease, and then the total life expectancy, and you can start studying the compression of morbidity. And that is that as you extend life expectancy, does this stay fixed, and you're simply increasing the prevalence of the lower quality life days and so forth. So anyway, it turns out that about, what is that? Do I have a percentage here? Yeah, nearly 1 in 5 days was spent in this unhealthy stage. You have gradients in monitored health. And yeah, anyway, that sets a stage for starting to look for health. I always think the health, the morbidity schedule in nature is the most important one. Once a bird has a problem, well, if it has a foot problem, it can still fly. If it has a wing problem, it's basically dead. It's just a detail what kills it, okay? There's the Carey away right in there, so, okay. Cut back on the crap, okay. Last of this section. I'll get through this. So look, here is one of the big problems. One of the non-problems in human demography is data. And you have birth dates, you have death dates, and I know you can get into remote tribes and you have problems, but in general you have data. In non-human populations, huge problem. You can count numbers, even that's a challenge many times. Age, are you kidding me? Huge challenge. So when we got money to do aging in the wild, we had NIH funding for this. I said, okay, instead of the mark recapture business, and there's even aging methods and so forth, which are just so crude. And mark recapture, it's like, let's release 100,000 and we'll get 10 back, okay. Oh, let's double the efficiency, now you get 20 back. You know, I mean, this is nothing. And so we tried to come up with a different concept, ask a different question about aging in the wild. So here's the deal. What if you have birth right in here, or emergence of a medfly, and it does its business out in the wild, you have no clue what it's doing, but then you capture it, okay? And then you can monitor this segment of the life, individual life course, okay? But you don't know, what does this capture segment? Now we do this for 100 flies or 1,000 flies or whatever, and that's all the information we have. We don't know whether we caught it right after it was born or reclosed, or the day before it's going to die, basically. We have no clue. So the question is, what can you do with those data? Okay. So I talked to my with Jim Bapel, but there's a lot of mathematicians in mathematical demography, as you might imagine. Well, with Bayesian statistics, I think we can work this out, but it's going to take several months, blah, blah, blah. Turns out that there's a simple solution for certain assumptions, a stationary population, okay? And so I don't have to talk about, I've already talked about that in a way. You can have this segment that lives one day, but it was born clear back here. This one also lives there. This is the black box right in here. That's the point. And so the question is, what can you do with that information, okay? So how do you determine age structure of a stationary population without knowing the age of a single individual within it, okay? How do you do it, okay? Here's the deal. Pretend all these are, pick your animal here, mice, insects, or whatever, and you have a population here. And you're going to sample them, and you have no clue what their ages are, okay? But let's cheat. Let's say we're going to take a peek, and we know all the ages. So these are color-coded age, all right? Now, we go through, collect them, or mark them, and now we're going to monitor them from, of all these mixed ages, from the point of our capture to, or marking, to death, okay? So here we have. So we have in our black box right in here, or our marked individuals, we have, this is the number of individuals in each of those age categories from that stationary population. So we have 40, 30, 25, and 5, okay? Now we're going to survive them forward, and we're going to count the number of deaths, okay? Anybody know this story? You do. Anyway, here's the post-capture deaths. So that every one of those back here, you're going to die whether you're 0 years old or whatever to 3 years old. Some are going to die, okay? And all those are going to stack up right in here. So we take those that die and put them in this category right in here of the times 0, okay? Then you do this, you keep doing this, and now they all die. Okay, look at that. Yeah, 40, 30, and so forth. This is the death distribution is exactly equal to the original age distribution. Vapel, I discovered this, and it was just not mathematically. I just played around, gnawed at it until it's kind of like there's got to be a mathematical statistical relationship here, and there was. They called it Carey's equality. And so the death distribution randomly captured individuals of unknown age in the stationary population reveals its age structure. Okay. Property number 1, that's what I just stated, and then property number 2, although they're really interconnected. And the proportion of individuals X days old in a population is equal to the proportion of X days to live. Okay? And so that here would be a population, you'd have this fraction that are exactly 90 to 95 days old. This would be in their stationary population. This equals the fraction that still have 90 to 95 years yet to live. Okay, that's the equivalency of this equality that I discovered. And then, but I'm going to get through this fast. That's the exact equality. Okay, and so that's what Bell, life lived and left, Carey's equality. Okay, there's then Nicholas Brouard, it turns out, had discovered this 10 years ago, but it was buried in a Cameroon handbook of population. But anyway, so, but anyway, that's another story. Okay. I got to cut my losses here. I'm seeing. Okay. Let me talk a little bit. This is only part 2, and I promise to finish in 10 minutes here. But let me just touch on the main points here. This is, remember the wasp story, is that this evolved, so now you have a nest, and you have long-lived, and these are fiercely defended. I thought about this a long time, but just recently I've really begun to develop it. And that is that all great apes make nests, and they sleep in a recumbent position, that is on their side, on their back, or whatever. Monkeys roost. Great apes sleep in a recumbent position. We're evolved from ancestors of great apes, so that there's no reason to believe Australopithecus and earlier versions of hominids and so forth didn't sleep just like that, and also built nests, okay? And so that the nest, we've all heard about caves and community and so forth. Of course, that's important. But I think one of the key evolutionary developments was this nest. And so that now you have, this is actually a picture we took. We went on a bottle of pygmy tour. And so now you have this hut. So the nest becomes a proto-hut, becomes a hut, becomes a house, and so forth. And this is really, really critical to the evolution of humans, in my view. They had to have huts. You have Australopithecus range, but Homo erectus, here's the range. This is in the literature where the humans can't survive if you don't have shelter below, if you in an environment 57 degrees or below. And the Australopithecus made it all through here. They were up here as well. They had to have huts. There's not enough caves for everybody. For that matter, you can't heat a whole cave. You have to have a hut to heat. Once you get a hut, because I'm going to skip over some stuff here. Once you get a hut, then you have a protofamily. I guess maybe I go there next. Yeah, let me skip through this. I'm sorry. And you have a protofamily, and with great apes, they just produce one, and then they kick it out, and then they have another one, and then they kick it out, and they have another. There's no overlap. Humans are the primate where you have a brood. That is, it's evolved a family. So I can see in the early stages you had, there's no trees for Junior to go to build his own nest, and so that he sticks around a little bit longer while the next one comes. You can see where I'm headed here, and pretty soon you have the overlap. And also, once you have a hut, I call it the first sleepover, so that males, it's like, why am I guarding out here? It's like, let me just go in and sleep with, And so that now you have what do they call it, clandestine sex and the intimacy and so on and so forth. There's a lot of things that flow from this nest concept. Everything from the family evolution to the pair bonding and so on and so forth that I'm really developing. And I've got to say, I've got to skip through this because I want to get to these controversies too. But anyway, there's the evolution. I'm going to burn through this fairly fast here. But you have different stages. What I wanted to say, that you started out with apes, they just have really two stages, the juvenile and the infant and juvenile. And then we have childhood and we have adolescence. These stages evolved, in my view. Part of the arguments has been, well, you don't want to teach somebody that's as tall as you are and so forth. I think it has more to do with the workforce. And so that's where So here is the great apes, one, kick out, one. Here you have our overlap in humans. But where I wanted to go here was this. And that is that there's an emerging literature in the anthropology literature where it has that really it's child labor, okay? Any farm family knows this, but anybody that has a mom and pop store knows it too. Everybody's into this, you got to pull your own weight. And certainly prehistoric humans, they had to. And so that you have different levels of, these are tasks. So you have a low skill, low strength. Kids can go out and collect shellfish and get little, fish and so forth, collect firewood. They can offset. It's not just a cost. They're not out there just hanging out, playing. They can contribute back to the family. Whoops, there. You have a low skill, high strength. You can carry wood. Anybody who's been to Africa or probably South, you see this. You have high skill, low strength, like making arrows or spears, and then of course high strength, high skill, that sort of thing. Okay, but so here's the net contributions. This would be here. That's the cost basically of a kid. A newborn is costly, but by they're 2 or 3, they're even more costly. But then they start sort of paying back. So this is all the way to 15 or 18 or whatnot. Now you bring all this together, and so now you have kids, but there's the workforce for the family, and that this is the net value. So anybody that's had kids kind of knows this, The first one's tough, the second one's tough, and pretty soon they're growing up and they can kind of pay it. That's the whole thing right in here, okay? And that's part of the, the evolutionary ecology of the family. I'm going to skip through lifespan here so I can get to this controversy. Hang on. 103. Okay. So let me talk. So that's what I have on that. I skipped through the lifespan. This is one of my specialties is lifespan. It's a shame I want to skip through that, but I really have to, so we have time for questions. But here's some controversies. And the biggest one is one I mentioned right up front. And that is the age of the oldest person. This Madame Calment, 122 years, 164 days. And so that my colleagues, in fact, I was alive when she was still alive. We were putting bets on how long she lived, but in 1997, she died, okay? And that Jim Vappel and Bernard Jean in Denmark and Jean-Marie Robin, French demographer, they all vetted this. You would know all of them, yeah. And you probably too. But anyways, so that they vetted this and said it's a real deal. And then this Russian comes along. He's a PhD student. This is just 3 months ago or several months ago. And said it's all fraud, okay? Evidence that she died in 1934. And so this got vicious. This email, I might have required reading for my students because it clearly is not private because they CC'd it to these 50 people of which I was on it and so forth, but it got personal. Really. Were you on that?
No, I just saw.
But anyway, evidence, and so that even this, anyway, I won't go there. But here's the deal. And so that it's just come out in New Scientist, and this is brand new. I don't even know if it's on the newsstands yet. But there she is, okay? He says this is the single most important data point in the entire field of gerontology. Okay. Maybe a little overstatement, but maybe not. It's kind of good. Okay. So that now, here's the key. Which one is this old woman? Here's the daughter. Here's the daughter, Yvonne. And this is actually Jean Calment, the mother. I mean, she looks young for a mother, daughter. But anyway, there's the mother, there's the daughter. And so it's the identity switch hypothesis is where we're headed here. And so you'd think that there'd be this face recognition software that would be able to sort this out for starters. But they're talking about exhuming the body and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, so here's the deal. So here's the original story. She's born in 1875, died in 122 years plus change. And so that then and her daughter was born 1898, died in 34 at age 36. Okay, so that this would be 59 years and then 99 years. So that would be the new model. Okay, so the hypothesis: Yvonne assumed her mother Jean's identity when she died in 1934. So here's the original: is that this is Jean, and then she died, and then she went on. Jean, just as the original story goes. Here's the switch hypothesis: is that 1934 that Jean dies, and then they switch the switch, and that is Yvonne says now she's Jean, okay, and then she goes on, and the idea here would be that this would be fraudulent, okay. Now, and so this is a big deal because they even have a monument basically, you know, to Jean Calment in France, and so the doyen of the world and all that kind of stuff, so that there's vested interest in sticking with the original story. And I thought this Zach had a pretty good story. If you read it, this is an idea for reading in demography. Assign that as a reading for Zach's paper, because he goes point by point, and it's like, my goodness, this is really a fraud. But in fact, then the guy in Denmark, not Denmark, the Netherlands, writes a paper that counters almost, have you seen that? I don't know, but he counters most of all the points basically. And it's like, yeah, for one thing, how do you switch, what's a funeral about? It's like, there was a public funeral, you know, and so forth. But anyway, it's really interesting. So the idea would be students read Zach's, and it's just convincing. Of course, it's a big fraud, and then you read the counter because, but anyway, it's make a great project, okay? Now, there's other controversies, that is trends in life, maximum lifespan. I'll just say that's a controversy. I'm not going to go into details here. And because there's the points. Where do you draw? This way, where do you go with that? Whether lifespan is maxed out, you know? That's the trends in maximum age of death. I'll go through this fast. Okay? And another one is that whether this is leveling off or not. Okay? There's a huge controversy now. We were the ones that found this in insects, and nobody has challenged that. That set the stage. But then people said maybe it occurs in humans and so forth. But there's a lot of pushback on that for humans. They haven't seen it in rodents, for example, and the leveling off. And so that's the three controversies. The trend in the slope business, the trend in maximal age, and then the Madame Calment controversy. Okay. And so, okay. So let me just jump ahead and I'll finish off here. Yeah, 131. Okay. So that just to touch on my book here, this was coming out. They say it's for fall release, but it'll be copyright 2020. But this will be the first book on biodemography, and I don't know, you know, this is literally a life work for me. But it's with Deborah Judge, who's a population biologist at the University of Virginia, and it's really packed full of, I think, really good information, interesting information. So you can go through all the chapters here, kind of the meat and potatoes of demography, but we have new takes on a lot of this, applications, and we have a whole section here we call biodemographic shorts. And these are little snippets, things that are really interesting, but don't fit neatly into you know, one of the chapters. What's the population growth rate for a man to have two wives? Okay, a 40-year-old man to have two wives. Okay, I have all that laid out here, but I don't have time to go through it. Okay, and let me just say, call to action here. What do you take away from this? I know I'm 5 minutes late here, but anyway, I think that for demography, that to start to integrate some of the basic concepts here. It's like the tree of life, is that humans are one species, but you have no perspective. I'm not saying you as in, but no perspective. You need a perspective more globally, just to be able to put humans into a more global context. It's like knowing the distance to the moon but not to the sun. You have no perspective, you know. And so that to start working biodemography into classical demography would be, I think, a good thing. And conversely, ecologists and population biology, huge amount to learn from demography. Demographers have been working on this for hundreds of years and really have it down. Okay. There's others, technical, this age business is a huge challenge, and then the evolutionary demography of humans. I think that there's a lot of potential there. We're working on it as I speak right here. And I think that's it. So thanks for everybody, and we'll just call it a afternoon. Sorry.